Bonjour, Kwei, et vous nom de Nordique, good morning. Je voudrais tout d'abord exprimer tous mes remerciements à Laurier Tourgeon pour l'invitation à cette conférence donnée à l'Université de Laval. Vous m'excuserez si mon français c'est pas bien, mais bon, j'essaierai de le faire bien. Le fait que nous soyons réunis en ce lieu, en compagnie de Stephen Oppenheimer et de Williamson, nous les devons au projet grâce auquel nous avons pu nous connaître. Ce projet s'appelle JAUZARREA. C'est le logotype. JAUZARREA doit son nom au lieu où se trouve son siège. En basque, Jauregi signifie le palais et Zarrea signifie vieux, ancien. Dans le palais de Bastan au Navarre, dans le Pays Basque. Son aspect nous est parvenu pratiquement intact depuis le XIVe siècle. La première mention qui est sans phare dans un document écrit date du XIe siècle, lorsque Bastan s'organise en tant que palais dans le royaume de Navarre. Depuis ma petite enfance, j'ai grandi en écoutant une série d'histoires sur nous, les Basques, des mythes et des légendes, selon ce que l'on nous répétait, comme cela s'était produit avec nos ancêtres. Chaque nuit, dans l'affaire de ma grand-mère, dans un lieu retiré de cette vallée, dans les Pyrénées, j'assistais fasciné aux récits que l'on racontait dans la cuisine. Ceci me permet de créer mon propre univers, quelque chose qui s'avérait complexe et qui luttait pour obtenir des réponses. Nous avons pu comparer, regrouper l'interprétation de chaque mythe, de chaque divinité, en différents lieux de notre pays, arrivant à la conclusion que l'homme dénombre une liste interminable de forces divines, de génies, d'êtres, et que dans chaque lieu, ils sont différents, et qu'en plus, ils font montre de comportements très disparatés. Le désir de chacun d'entre nous d'obtenir des réponses à cet inconnu a fait proliférer une quantité considérable d'êtres, les mythes et leurs personnages répondant à des exigences de la logique humaine, dans la soif d'expliquer le monde qui nous entoure. Tout ce qui a un nom existe. Cependant, désormais, entre peu d'années, nous assistons à un changement d'une importance capitale pour l'ensemble de notre peuple, ainsi pour tous ceux qui nous entourent, pour le monde, qui ont apporté des explications, excusez-moi, car sont arrivés de nouveaux êtres qui ont apporté des explications logiques à nos légendes. Plus encore, il s'agit de ces explications démontrées de manière empirique, des preuves solides et prometteuses pour suivre dans cette voie le but d'obtenir la connaissance nécessaire pour nous rapprocher davantage de la réalité. Grâce à la conjonction d'innombrables disciplines, ces êtres vont déchiffrer des codes occultes qui tiennent néanmoins devant nous. Avant, avec un regard limpide, sans préjudice, ils nous fournissent des réponses honnêtes. Désormais, nous savons que, main dans la main, comme dans une socadance de cérémonie, c'est une danse basque de cérémonie dont certaines d'entre vous se souviendront pour l'avoir vu lors du premier congrès célébré à Bilbao en 2011. Nous allons être capables de parcourir un long chemin en leur compagnie en quête de la connaissance. Ce sont des chercheurs que je me suis efforcé de trouver durant les 20 dernières années. Il y a 10 ans, j'ai commencé à tracer quelques lignes de pensée pour pouvoir rassembler leurs travaux et donner une réponse à tous ces thèmes en suspense pour moi depuis mes 7 ans, lorsque j'ai commencé à dessiner mes inquiétudes. 40 années dédiées à la photographie, à la conception et à l'édition de plus de 200 livres rendirent impossible l'amitié avec des centaines de chercheurs. Après des années de contact avec les unes et avec les autres, nous pûmes donner forme à ce que nous connaissons comme JAUZARREA en 2009, le Fonds pour l'étude de la diffusion de la culture basque. Ce Basque Database, comme on appelle Keikosoa, c'est un récipient qui contient de tout, constituera une banque de données au niveau mondial sur toute la connaissance pouvant être réunie en ce qui concerne les Basques, pour que dans le futur, n'importe quel chercheur qui aura recours à cette source puisse le faire en toute confiance avec la certitude que tout ce que l'on y trouvera sera d'une rigueur absolue. Tout cela pourra donner lieu plus tard à l'utilisation de ces corpus de connaissances Et on pourrait promouvoir l'approfondissement de l'étude de la culture ancestrale en Europe occidentale. JAUZARREA se caractérise par son dynamisme, et capacité de fédérer. Plus de 3000 personnes ont collaboré avec nous, avec un intérêt commun pour la culture et la langue, entendant cette dernière comme la synthèse de toute cette culture. La langue basque, l'euskara, il s'agit d'un bien immatériel transmis depuis au moins plus de 60 000 générations. Mais il s'agit d'aller au-delà, d'arriver à la conception même du langage, dans l'être humain et son articulation sur les guides du groupe, son développement et sa projection, en articulant tout ce qui peut être considéré comme appartenant à cette culture, les sauveurs, les protégeurs et les préserveurs, pour arriver à expliquer le processus qui a lieu lors des 45 000 ans dans cette partie de l'Europe. Ensuite, aussi, avec toute l'information disponible, nous sommes sûrs que nous pourrons aller plus loin et revenir en arrière vers notre lieu d'origine en Afrique. En trouvant des clés qui nous permettent de collaborer de cette manière pour désigner cet arbre en entier, cette histoire, celle de notre espèce et tout ce qui la concerne. Les Basques recherchons nos origines comme le fait n'importe quel autre peuple, quel qu'il soit l'endroit où il s'est établi sur la planète. Nous voulons voir enfin la photo de famille suspendue sur le mur de notre foyer avec tous ses membres, même ceux dont on nous avait jamais parlé. Nous sommes humains, inquiets et curieux. En 5 ans, nous avons mené à bien 5 congrès et 27 conférences auxquelles ont assisté des milliers de personnes. De cette manière, nous sommes en train de créer un réseau social très large. Nous avons établi contact avec 147 chercheurs de 32 institutions scientifiques et d'universités de 12 pays. Tout cela grâce au travail volontaire, au travail commun pour le bien commun. Ce trait qui est encore empiré au Pays Basque est celui du travail en Haute-Hollande. C'est des travaux entre tous, touchant toute la communauté. Ceci fait que toutes ces personnes s'entendent des objectifs de JAUZARREA comme le leur. Et de cette manière aussi, nous faisons que nous inviter, parties prenantes, chercheurs du monde entier, puisqu'ils adoptent la même attitude. Ces chercheurs, ils souhaitent s'impliquer chaque fois davantage dans d'autres groupes pour travailler directement avec nous ou entre eux, créant de nouvelles lignes de recherche. De nombreuses personnes des milieux très différents de notre société nous aident à nous occuper d'eux durant le séjour. À les connaître, ils comprennent les racines, percevant les marques d'identité qui nous unissent en tant qu'êtres humains à la terre-mère. Et ils sont surpris par notre culture, par beaucoup inconnue, par beaucoup méconnue. Ils reconnaissent cet être humain dont ils avaient déjà fait la connaissance dans les Premières Nations du Saint-Laurent, en Afrique, en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée ou dans le Caucase, et se reconnaissent eux-mêmes. Tout ceci, dans son ensemble, a servi pour que notre collaboration depuis JAUZARREA, bien qu'étant vraiment modeste, leur devienne utile. Et c'est pour cette raison que tout cela a été extraordinaire, car nous sommes tous reliés à la nature qui nous héberge. Ce n'est pas pour rien que nous nous considérons une première nation européenne. Nous sommes des indigènes européens. Je crois sincèrement que nous sommes sur la bonne voie. Je parle uniquement en nom de JAUZARREA. Je ne sais jusqu'à quel point de notre objectif défini initialement nous parviendrons, mais je peux vous assurer qu'en cours de route, nous avons gagné en relation humaine de manière extraordinaire. Et cette convivialité est ce qui nous permet déjà d'aborder des projets communs. Et nous croyons que ces projets vont générer, grâce à tous ces nouveaux lutins ou elfes que nous avons importés par avion depuis leur lieu d'origine, une nouvelle connaissance dont nous espérons qu'elle pourra entraîner la modification de plus d'un paradigme. Nous sommes réellement très surpris des résultats des travaux de ces chercheurs, dont nous avons pu avoir connaissance et tous nous, excusez-moi, nous avons parti pour avoir connaissance et nous les restituerons dans une publication commune synthèse de toutes leurs contributions, complétant ainsi la première étape par la divulgation de la chronologie des 45 000 ans de la présence de l'Homo sapiens en Europe occidentale. En même temps, on a le programme Origna Urquía en Canada, c'est la relation des Basques et les Premières Nations, qui nous permettra de faire la même chemin comme en Atlantia. C'est pour toutes ces raisons que sont aujourd'hui présents ces deux conférencières, Ron Williamson et Steven Oppenheimer. Merci beaucoup.
Je me parle anglais. Je m'excuse de ne pas parler français, mais il y a beaucoup de temps. Okay. So I'll be talking about the salutatorian hypothesis, which Laurie has already introduced to you, and I'm sure many people are familiar with, but from a genetic perspective. It's about the migrations, possible migration routes, and how many of them into the Americas. I think probably a majority of people would say that there was more than one migration into the Americas. And in my book in 2003, I drew a map which included 4 of them. This is just part of the map, and includes the entry from Siberia across the Beringian continent and the transatlantic route, which we've already heard about. Before going into that, I just want to put a bit of background. I think there are misconceptions about reconstructions of genetic scientific approaches to looking at migrations and possible conflicts between that and oral history, cultural history, prehistory. I don't think there should be any conflict. They are attempts to look at the same questions from different perspectives because we're all interested in our origins. And prehistory is multidisciplinary. Study areas include archaeology, cultural history, genetics, climatology, and oceanography. And not one of these has precedence over the other necessarily. Cultural history, of course, includes both written material, but also oral origin stories, which, in my experience, do contain some interesting details, and I'll very briefly discuss that. So in my view, genetics need not be seen as a challenge to cultural history, but as an adjunct. I'm actually a pediatrician. I spent most of my working life in the tropics, in the Pacific. I spent 5 years in Papua New Guinea, and I was doing research. I did my thesis work there, and some of the genetic findings in my thesis work surprised me, and I was asked about these by a local village elder. I couldn't understand what the difference was between the people on the coast and inland, and he said, well, you should realize they're different people. And he told me an origin myth which included the mainstream populations of New Guinea, but also the so-called Austronesian-speaking populations who came in from Southeast Asia. He didn't describe it in those terms, but that's exactly what he was talking about. And this myth probably goes back 5,000 years. And added to that, people actually draw their stories on storyboards. And this, on the left, the storyboard, is actually a story of that migration myth. And it's correlated with the genetics and the linguistics. So that was really the sort of entree to my first book, which was about the population of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Less about origin stories in my subsequent books, Out of Eden, which was out of Africa, and The Peopling of the World, and The Origins of the British, which Laurie has just mentioned. Now, I'll be talking about genetic phylogeography, which is different from the sort of genetics that most geneticists do in terms of prehistory and population genetics. This is genetic phylogeography, which, if you translate the Greek, it means putting the tree on the map. Phylos is a tree, geography, of course, is the map. And this study is the study of the geographic spread of specific gene lines. So it's not the study of populations. Obviously, those populations carry the gene lines, but one can be very specific when you look at the spread of gene lines in populations. There are three components. The first is to produce a detailed gene tree based on unique mutations, a network of descent, rather like Charles Darwin did, but in his notes. And the best parts of our genome to do this, because they don't recombine, they don't shuffle at each generation, they stay very clearly inherited, just with occasional mutations, are our mitochondrial DNA, which we get from our mothers, and we all have, the Y chromosome, which only the guys have. And both of those are non-recombining and can be used to produce these gene trees. You then look at the distribution of these branches on the gene trees. Literally, you take the tree and you lay it on the map. The diversity of the clusters and the branches, that is the bushiness of the branches, can be used to estimate the time, the date of the movement of those gene lines from one place to another, from the source to the target population. And if you take all three of those approaches together, you can actually do founder analysis. You can analyze all the different lines coming from one area to another, and you can estimate the time and the proportion. And you can also look at the contribution of those first founders to an empty location to the modern population, and it's surprisingly high. There's a principle which goes under many different words. I call it first come, first serve, but the founders are very often well represented in the modern population. So here's an imaginary gene tree. It's been converted into a network, so the root of the tree is in the center, the root ancestor there, and it's color-coded. So the source region is in maroon, and the target region is in green. And the little yellow points each represent new mutations which have occurred in a mother at a particular time and then are passed down to her descendants. So the green represents the target region. Let's say the red there is Africa and the target region is the rest of the world. You can see that there's a shared gene type here, but on arriving in the target region, that gene type continues to diversify so that you can call that new branch a founding event. So we've got migrating descendants. So just to re-emphasize, it's looking at a gene tree and tracing the movement of that gene tree and multiple branches on the map. And this is a map, a tree, a rather summary tree, because each of these discs doesn't represent a gene type but a cluster. And that's for the whole of the world. And it's color-coded. So on the left we have Africa, and the oldest root of the modern human population is about 200,000 years ago, and that's found in Africa. And in fact, most of the diversity in the world is found in Africa. That's all those green discs. And this big disc here is the rest of the world, which belongs to one twig of one branch of the African tree. From that, you can infer that there was only one successful exit from Africa, because if there were different or multiple exits, you would have different representatives of all of these green branches coming out at different times. But actually, you've only got one. And so that tells us that at one point, there was a single successful migration out of Africa. Obviously, there have been to and fro movements since then, but this represents, and this, of course, is color-coded for the rest of the populations of the world. And so in my 2003 book, based on this, this gene tree, I was able to map the approximate migrations of people outside of Africa. I thought they came across the Red Sea based on the distribution of branches outside Africa. But here we're concentrating on the possible entry into the New World. And as we'll discuss a little later, this is approximately 14,000 years ago. Quite recently, Paisley Cave in Washington State, we have a site where there's human material, which has two of the main migrating branches coming out of the Old World. It's dated with some tools to around 14,000 years ago. Now, there is, however, a site in North America, in Meadowcroft, which has cultural dates going back much earlier than that, back as far as possibly 19,000, though a certain sector of archaeologists might disagree with that. But those are the results from Meadowcroft. When I was writing the book, I went along with the majority view that this was the only route into the New World. I thought I'd heard of the Solutrean hypothesis, and as we'll see, I put it in the map, but I thought it was completely impossible. So I have changed my mind since then. So there are four theoretical routes into the Americas, as I mentioned earlier, coming in through Alaska, the coastal route, which is now very popular. Another route which is thought to have come down between the ice caps and into central North America. And the Solutrean hypothesis, which as I say, I did put in 2003. And there was a view that I think probably still is a view that people actually sailed across the Pacific a very long way and arrived in the south. So we'll be talking about these two possibilities, which are not mutually exclusive. That means it could be both, coming in from the west and coming in from the east. Now, going back to the last glacial maximum, which is when there was the maximum, most recent ice cover in North America. So we're looking around 18,000 years ago. You can see that Canada was completely covered. On the west side, tundra goes up to about there. On the east side, a bit higher, around Nova Scotia. But we do have this Paleo-Indian cultural evidence from between 19,000 and 15,000. And this is a recent review of earliest cultural dates along the east coast of North America. I've taken one particular shot out because it's only Meadowcroft that shows this early spike between 19 and 17,000 years ago. Starting around 14,000 and later, the whole of North America is showing cultural sites. So the rest of the figures for the East Coast show the second large evidence for cultural activity. Question is, how did the Meadowcroft culture, people who made that 19,000 to 15,000 year site, get into North America if there was a complete block of ice in the way? One possibility, of course, as might be suggested by the Solutrean hypothesis, if they came across the Atlantic, they may have landed somewhere along the east coast, maybe, which of course was more exposed then because the sea level was lower along the banks, and come down. Alternatively, they could have started in Meadowcroft and gone up but that doesn't explain how they got there. Then around 13,000 years ago, there's rather less ice, and you can see up here the potential corridor, which was indicated in that line that I showed in the previous slide. There's more possibility for coastal communication between what's now the USA and the Nova Scotia further north. And so that from that melting, there was a re-expansion of peoples possibly going up from the south further north to the northeast. At least that's on, and this is all completely speculative. But if we accept that there were people living at Meadowcroft before then, that's what they could have done. On the west coast, on the other hand, we have this earliest evidence so far of presence in Paisley Cave with the mitochondrial founding gene lines A2 and B2 found. And the site is carbon dated to 14,000 years. That's interesting because it fits with the estimated founding ages of the main four American mitochondrial founding lines, the A, B, C, and D. A, B, and C, and D all date as founders to about 14,000. So Paisley Cave could be one of the earliest bits of evidence for the movement in from Siberia. But it doesn't explain Meadowcroft. And that, I think, is the point that the archaeologists, Stanford and Bradley, would make. Meadowcroft, after a gap, reactivates in terms of cultural evidence around 13,500 years. And sometime after that, the Clovis toolkit appears right across North America. And it appears so suddenly that it's difficult to work out a direction, a cultural direction of flow. You just have these sites appearing very rapidly. I mean, of course, I'm speaking outside my own field here, but that's what I understand. So the possibility is that the toolkit, which the solution hypothesis says came from Europe, could have re-expanded in the middle of Pennsylvania and gone east and west. When I wrote my book in 2003, I had a speculative view of the movement into Northwest America, into Alaska, from the Old World. And looking at the gene lines, the founding gene lines, which are found both in males and the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, it didn't seem to me that there was a single location that you could say that's where they came from. So, for instance, the mitochondrial DNA types A, D, and B4 are found on the east coast of Eurasia. A, D, and B probably originate much further south. Let's just click those. I did feel that if you looked at the Y chromosome data, Central North Asia seemed a more likely source for those lineages. So there was, in a sense, was a disjunct between the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. But there were two gene lines which I really fooled myself had actually come across the whole of Eurasia. One was R1, which we'll talk about shortly, which is the R1b is the main European male gene line, and the other was X, which doesn't occur in East Eurasia. Is found exclusively in West Eurasia and Northeast America. And just recently, I'm sure everyone recognizes this reconstruction. There are better reconstructions, but I put it there just to match Jean-Luc. The Kennewick man recently has had ADNA analysis, and he has actually got the X2A, the unique American branch of X, and he dates to around 9,000 years. Could X2A in North America be explained by the Solutrean hypothesis? Well, in my mind, the Solutrean hypothesis is the only archaeological model, the only cultural model that would be able to explain it, because X2A doesn't come from East Eurasia, it comes from West Eurasia. What does Solutrean mean anyway? I won't go into the archaeology because I'll get it all wrong. But the Solutrean culture was around the last glacial maximum, up to around 18,000 years. And it was either side of the Pyrenees, in northern Iberia, but also in southern France. And distinct from the epigravettian culture further east, and characterized by a toolkit, the most important, or the most famous part of which is the beautiful biface spear points. And it's this toolkit which Bradley and Dennis, got in his name now, Stanford, argue came across. So, but its last glacial maximum, it disappears after that in Europe. So if it's going to get across the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, it would have to be around that time at the last glacial maximum. Now let's have a look at the worldwide distribution of the relevant branch of X2. It's also this roughly almost exactly the same distribution of X group as a whole, but X2 is the relevant one here. And we find X2 here exclusively in West Eurasia and along the north coast of Africa. There's a small bit found in the Russian Altai, but quite clearly that's a recent founding event around 2,500 years ago, based on the diversity of that small branch in the Russian Altai. So there doesn't appear to be any trail going across from West Eurasia into northeast Siberia or even into Alaska. But the highest frequency of X2 anywhere is in northeastern America, in particular in Canada, and in particular characterizing people speaking Algonquin languages north of the Great Lakes. Clearly, if it came across at the last glacial maximum, it wouldn't have been residing on the ice. It would have been further south, for instance, in Pennsylvania. Now, if we look at the two possibilities, one is that X2A or X2 came all the way across East Eurasia. That's this model, A model, and found its way particularly to the northeastern part of America, is actually extremely unlikely. Looking at migration models of lines, you always have a trail, even across the Pacific, for all of the specific lineages going across with the Polynesians. You have a trail, and you have a trail going through every island. There is no trail at all, and this is looking at tens of thousands of samples. There is no evidence that X went this way across East Eurasia. The alternative model is the transatlantic route, which is why I say that if one's looking at the Solutrean hypothesis, that's the only one that actually would predict this sort of genetic finding. Of course, the B model doesn't answer the specifics, the cultural specifics of the Solutrean hypothesis, but it gives you a direction. And this is the gene tree of X as a whole. As I mentioned, it's all restoration, and that's this mauve colouring here. It's one of the earliest branches outside Africa of that single lineage coming out of Africa, and it's just stayed in West Eurasia. It never went to East Eurasia. And it multiplies around the last glacial maximum. So these figures here are ages of the estimated ages of each of these nodes. And so X2 is around 22,000 years. And then there's a small branch of X2, X225, which is around 21,000 years. And here we have the American branch. It's actually the American branches, because recently on complete sequencing, and this figure's based on complete sequencing, there's a new X2 branch, X2G, which is also found in Algonquin-speaking populations. That blue disc there represents the nearest, the most recent common ancestor, the other side of the Atlantic, in fact in Egypt. Not in the Basque country or anywhere else, but it's in Egypt. That doesn't mean that it has to be from there. It's clear that there are ancestors in the Mediterranean for the American X2A, and there certainly aren't ancestors to X2A anywhere else in East Eurasia. And we can look at this complete sequence tree in a bit more detail. I'm not going to go over it in detail. The point is the names at the bottom. This doesn't represent all the genetic evidence for X2A. This is all the ones which have had complete sequencing, the whole genome sequenced. And except for the one outlined in green, they're all Algonquin-speaking populations. The ones in green appear to be a separate, rather later branch that came out of North America or Northeast America down to the southwest and is found in the Jemez Pueblo population and among the Sioux, and seems to be specific to those ethnic groups. And there we have Egypt as the X2J, shows some relationship, of course. Now, because we've got X2G in the Americas, the estimate of the age needs to be close to the estimate of X2 rather than the age estimate of X2A. So we're looking at about the last glacial maximum. Leaving mitochondrial DNA for a bit to go to the other non-recombining lineage, the Y chromosome. As I said, the main Y chromosome type in Western Europe is R1b, and there's been quite a lot of work on this, and it's still in great ferment, but essentially there hasn't been any disproof of the concept backed up in other lineages that R1b was present at high frequency in the Basque Ice Age refuge and spread up, as the ice melted, spread up the west coast, going to places like Ireland and as far as Scandinavia. We look at the worldwide distribution of R1b. It's, as that previous figure shown, and the other highest place is around the Great Lakes. And the rates here around the Great Lakes are between 60 and 100%. And these are far higher than any admixed populations in the New World for European lineages. So it is an anomaly which is consistent with the X2A findings, but needs to be explored because the resolution of the R1b lineages in First Nations populations here in North America are quite a few years old and therefore very poorly resolved. So it's really important to do extensive sequencing to determine whether or not R1b came earlier and wasn't just a recent introduction. I should say that in the Americas here, the shaded patterns are just looking at First Nations populations. And so the comparison in terms of frequency can be made with those other populations in South America and in the north here. We can look a bit more at the Y chromosomes in the United States. Native Americans, a study in 2005. About 1/3 of Y chromosomes in the populations Hannah studied are European and 2/3 Native American. A large chunk of European lineages are R1, B1. If we look further in the Hammer paper and look at the frequency as one goes from west to east across the USA and the frequency of European versus First Nations lineages in the Y chromosome, we find very high rates in the West, in the Apache, the Navajo, the Pima, the Cheyenne. And as you come over to northeastern USA, you've got South Dakota, the Sioux, and the Vermont. And the white bar here is European Y chromosomes. And so in Vermont, almost all of the Y chromosomes in that study are West Eurasian, Western European. And this is a distance map based on the different Y chromosome frequencies in the respective populations in this study. And here we have the Sioux and the South Dakota. These are all European American in this top left-hand corner, and the Vermont group are actually right in the middle of that as far as their Y chromosome is concerned. Now we can look at the USA pie chart in a slightly different way. That's the ages of those lineages, which are found, the ultimate ages, their roots. And R1, B1 is European late glacial or Mesolithic. And the I group, which is shown here, is actually the oldest Y chromosome lineage in Europe. It's indigenous, unique to Europe. And that goes back to the Paleolithic. If, on the other hand, we look at a pie chart from an Algonquin-speaking population, this is from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, which are near the Canadian-US border, right in the center, we find a completely different pattern. The Native American population represent this small, in terms of their Y chromosomes, represent a rather small segment rather than 2/3. And a large part of the remainder, of course, is the Europeans, but with different proportions. So there's a vast amount of R1b, but there's also more haplogroup I than you would expect, because in European populations, I is actually quite uncommon. It's a Paleolithic lineage. And if we look at the European Neolithic, it occupies this very small segment here. So there are suggestive features in these findings, but it really needs a lot more work on it to look at it in more depth and try and answer some of those questions. Going on to the rest of our genome, nuclear genome, autosomal nuclear data, there's been a few papers in the lab since 2012 on this. This is a paper which looked at all of a wide range of North and South American populations and the Far Eastern Siberians, the Aleutians, and the Inuit peoples, and also Mexico down to South America. The Canadian populations that are represented here, which include 3 Algonquin-speaking populations and one Nadeni, the Chippewayan, is a separate branch. It separates from the rest of continental America and from Greenland and Siberia. Now, I'm using the figure I showed earlier on to indicate some important ancient DNA sites which have been used to look at the first peopling of the Americas. One of these is 24,000 years old from Malta, which has some Gravettian culture in it. I think it's the furthest east that the Gravettian culture got. Another site is the Anzic site, which was published recently, where the material was associated, not directly because there was a small separation of time, but with Clovis tools. So it wasn't actually found with Clovis tools on the same date, but in the same site. And they compare the autosomal representation in these two samples with the Quiritiana, who are a population in the middle of Brazil, who have no historical evidence for contact, post-Columbian contact with Europeans. When I mean contact, admixture contact. So that the Quiritiana are regarded as a population that one wouldn't expect on the conventional view to have any West Eurasian lineages. And so the next few slides are rather heavy duty, but they all address this problem which is an apparent evidence for West Eurasian lineage mutations, single nucleotide polymorphisms in the Quiritiana. They didn't look at the possibility in northeastern America and didn't actually approach that question. So one of these studies, using ancient DNA, and this is the Anzic study, found evidence for Pleistocene West Eurasian autosomal admixture in the Americas by two types of analysis, using the three sites, Anzic, Malta, and Quiritiana, Quiritiana, of course, being the modern population. They assumed this admixture came from Siberia, and that's all they say in the paper. They don't explore the possibility that it came from anywhere else. But a lot of this autosomal work, there is a problem of direction. You cannot. These are contingency tables which are being looked at, and statistical results. They don't actually give you the direction that you get from looking at a lineage tree. They inferred that Native Americans have mixed origins resulting from admixture between peoples related to modern-day East Asians and West Eurasians. And Quiritiana had 14 to 38% Western Eurasian ancestry. Now, this is a population that has no post-Columbian admixture. This evidence for Pleistocene West Eurasian autosomal admixture in the Americas is predicted by the selection hypothesis, which was not tested. And to quote again from the article, another approach, the Northern Amerind, that's the Canadian groups, carry ancestry from a previously undocumented stream of gene flow from the Old World. They looked in Siberia for evidence of this undocumented stream of gene flow. They didn't find any, but they still assumed that that's the route it took. They didn't test the possibility that the admixture had come across the Atlantic. This ancient West Eurasian genetic affinity was also detected when they put into the analysis modern Western Eurasian populations, including West Europeans, Orkney, French Basque, the French and North Italians. And all of these Western European populations, in particular the Orkney group, had greater affinity with Quiritiana than the Middle East or Central and South Asia. Again, not what you would expect if the route had been across Central Asia. You'd expect a declining relationship. And then finally, this is a 2012, it's a block quote from a study. These are all sort of related groups working on this material. And this is a paragraph titled evidence for Northeast Asian-related genetic material in Europe. We single out from Table 5 the score for French arising as an admixture of Caritiana, an indigenous population from Brazil, and Sardinians. So these three populations, because the particular test they use, they're looking at shared drift, genetic drift, and you use three populations for this. And it's highly significant, their result. A Z-score of 18.4 is extremely significant. And then they say, we do not, of course, think there's been substantial gene flow back into Europe from Amazonia, which, of course, people would probably agree with. The only plausible explanation we can see for our signal of admixture into the French is that an ancient northern Eurasian population contributed genetic material to both the ancestral population of the Americas and the ancestral population of northern Europe. Now, if that was the case, you would expect to see some evidence in northeastern Eurasia. And they say this is quite surprising to us, and in the remainder of the article, this is the effect we discuss. End quote. To me, this seems quite upside down and just totally ignores the possible transatlantic route. And as I say, there's no evidence for a Northeast Asian source in their data. And this is the extract from their Table 5. A third of the significant triplets included an American First Nations population, most of them Caritiana, but also the Surui and the Maya and the Pima. This is using the Human Genome Diversity Project data. And all the ones in blue are in West Eurasia. And we can see that on the map. And the Human Genome Diversity Project has no lack of sources in East Eurasia, but none of them were included in any of these triplets. So if you're going to suggest that there is a relationship, the relationship is between West Eurasia and this unexplained European admixture. And it certainly doesn't geographically include Malta in terms of the site of Malta. So it's definitely in West Eurasia. So none of the significant F3 tests with a New World source target had any East Eurasian source. All of the other sources and significant New World F3 tests had West Eurasian, North African members. And the West Eurasian source distribution was coincident with that of the Old World distribution of X2A. So in conclusion, cultural prehistory and biological prehistory represent different perspectives of the same motivations and attempts to explain our origins. There are no certainties. There are hypotheses, and the hypotheses need to be further tested, but they should be tested without any preconceptions of which way people came. Ancestral First Nation founders may have come from both the West and the East. I don't think any people would disagree with the West. I certainly don't. There's good evidence for gene flow from the West. Canada was covered in ice at the last glacial maximum. Different ancestral founders would likely have come north up the east coast and south down the west coast as the ice melted. mtDNA complete sequencing makes an Asian Beringian source of X2A and X2G even less likely, but it makes a peri-Mediterranean source more so. Pre-Clovis, East Coast founding is suggested by X2 dates and is consistent with Meadowcroft and the cultural dates there. Overrepresentation of European pre-Neolithic Y lineages, R1b and I, in Great Lakes Algonquin speakers, would also be consistent with the inferences from X2A, co-distribution, and with early European and or Mediterranean East Coast founders. R1b haplotypes unique to the Americans would be predicted by the ancient transatlantic founding. Now that's a slide I left out, but essentially if you look at the tree, the network of these European lineages in First Nation populations, there are a number of haplotypes which are unique to First Nations. They are derived from R1B, but they look like evolved sites, so that they're very unlikely to have come in the last 500 years. They're more likely to have come much earlier. But I left that out, there isn't time. Nuclear autosomal studies are consistent with transatlantic admixture from Western Europe, and I'm not going to discuss the later migrations. So thank you very much.
Well, good morning. The French on the slide are T's. I am not going to present in French. I just thought I would put the titles in French and the information on the slides. I obviously have nothing to do with Stephen Oppenheimer's research and what he's looking at in terms of the peopling of the New World. However, I have kind of linked on to Stephen and his work because we do have research questions that can be addressed by genetic research in the Great Lakes region. And one of them is this question. If you look at this slide, you will see this gray zone, which is the gray zone that shows where Iroquoian speakers were on the Erie Basin, the north shore of the Erie Basin, the Lake Ontario Basin, and extending up the St. Lawrence River. And if you look around that gray zone, you will see only Algonquian speakers. Algonquian and Iroquoian are two completely different language families. So one of our questions, an enduring question, has been, where did the Iroquoian language come from? Did it arrive in the Great Lakes region, as has been proposed several times, with maize from the south? And what Iroquoian-speaking population would have introduced a technology that was so popular that populations would have adopted it? That's assuming, of course, that there was no large-scale population replacement in that area, people having lived there for 11 or 12,000 years. We do not believe that. And there is a very preliminary piece of mtDNA work that links a local southwestern Ontario population with people from the Mantle site, an ancestral Wendat site just near Toronto, with a common ancestor that suggests, and only suggests, that perhaps the Iroquoian way of life is mapped onto local populations that were Algonquian speaking. And so we should see genetic similarity between Algonquian people and Iroquoian people. The problem with the existing data is that we don't have Iroquoian peoples tested, but for those few samples of Wendat 2 years ago. And so we would like to expand the research that Stephen is doing to explore that question. Of course, these are the famous St. Lawrence Iroquoian clusters along the St. Lawrence that existed prior to about 1580. When Europeans arrived, this is where the various people were. I've included kind of that yellow zone. That yellow zone is where we find ancestral Wendat peoples, the peoples that we believe contributed nations to the historic confederacy of the Wendat. We have been working, our firm has been working with the Wendat for the past 5 years to map every site we can that we know to be Huron and where there has been substantial excavation. Many of them complete village excavations. Not in this area, but I'll show you in a second. I want to point out to you the nations. This is the area of the Deer Nation, or excuse me, the Rock Nation. This is the area of the Deer Nation. These are the Cord, and these are the Bear. It is believed that people moved. These are all very early sites that date to around 1300 AD. And it is believed that the colonization of this area from people from the north shore of Lake Ontario occurred at that time, and people settled in this area, and they moved up there, up into this area, and became the ancestors of the Bear and the Cord. These people, we believe, came from the north shore of Lake Ontario around 1610, and these people came from this area around 1580. We know that because when Champlain arrived, he landed here, made his way over to this area, to Cahiagoué, and went on a excursion against the Onondaga, or some New York Iroquois group, and his route took him through here, and the people from here said, this is where we used to live. And he continued down towards the north shore of Lake Ontario, crossed the lake, and had an excursion against a village in 1615. Here are the north shore of Lake Ontario villages and communities, and I'm going to focus on these two, Mantle and Parsons. We had a conference last weekend in which archaeologists from Quebec and Ontario and New York came together to explore what are the relationships between these people, the people in historic Wendake, the Iroquois in New York State, and the St. Lawrence Iroquois. And one thing we've always known is that these populations are very close, but what is the nature of the affinity between these populations? One thing that Laurier mentioned is that many of the sites in this area have been excavated as a result of cultural resource management, because in the Toronto area there is so much expansion and the legislation is very strong, and it calls for excavation in advance of land use development. So before a subdivision can happen, the proponent has to do archaeology and all of it. So we have a database that is unparalleled throughout Iroquois. So there are some principles which you can read here that I want to talk about, the most important of which is that the St. Lawrence Iroquois are not a confederacy, and at the time I'm talking about, neither are the Huron and neither are the New York Iroquois. At this time, these are villages or communities that are autonomous, and it is the role of the archaeologist between 1300 and 1500 to try and figure out what the relationships are between these communities. And the other thing is that they are fluid on the landscape. They move, segments of communities move, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later. But it's very important that we realize that this culture history is not fixed. It's exceptionally dynamic. What I like to say to students is, as complex is the present, so it was in the past. It was exceedingly complex. Our reconstructions of the past have to be just as complex. Peter Ramsden, who worked in the Trent Valley and in the area of the Benson site on Balsam Lake, he first said that he thought that St. Lawrence Iroquoian Wendat interaction started in the 15th century. And it was based on pottery that is this kind. It's called cornier. It's a very distinctive pottery type that the Wendat did not traditionally make in their area, but is certainly made in the St. Lawrence Valley. And we excavated at the Parsons site in the late 1980s, and we found a collector, an avocational archaeologist who had 250,000 artifacts from that site, having worked there for about 10 years. A number of us saw that collection, and when we went back to his house about 4 years later, he was gone, and he had died, and there's no track of his collection. We don't know what happened to that collection. Parsons is an exceptionally big site. It's what we call a coalescent site, which I'll explain in a second. But it's on the Humber River. And we were asked to do a swath across the site, which we did, and found a series of longhouses, a very extensive palisade on this side, a less extensive palisade halfway down the slope, a series of houses and middens. What we found was that about 10% of the pottery on the site was St. Lawrence Iroquoian. And this is a site that dates to AD 1450, which is relatively early for that kind of interaction to be happening. Well, it's even more surprising when we compare that with some of the frequencies in the Trent Valley, which we know was a heavy area in the late 16th century or mid to late century for St. Lawrence Iroquoian Huron interaction. So this area here is where all of that material came from. In fact, 77% of it came from that area, from these two houses and the middens in this area. So what we believe is that there was actually a population of St. Lawrence Iroquoians at 1450 that came to live at this site. In the University of Toronto collections, we found like literally dozens and dozens of pieces. This has never been published. Dozens of pieces of St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery from this site. So we know there was a large population of St. Lawrence Iroquoians living at the Parsons site in the Humber River Valley in Toronto at 1450. Classic St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery. So, what can we conclude? We know that with people living at Parsons, that segments of St. Lawrence Iroquoian communities were moving at this period, and they were moving at what we call the pre-coalescent and coalescent period, which I'll get to in a minute. And we don't know what's causing that. Between 1450 and 1500, there is widespread hostility throughout Iroquois, and it could be that however that hostility was occurring, it resulted in St. Lawrence Iroquoians leaving their communities and joining with Wendat communities. The question would be, from which St. Lawrence Iroquoian clusters were these people coming? And we didn't know that, but we're starting to get more clues with recent research. So the Mantle site is what's called a coalescent site. Between 1400 and 1450, the villages on the North Shore have 3 to 5 houses, no palisades, but starting at 1450, they move into larger villages and they consolidate several of these smaller villages. So they become much larger, with populations of 1,500 to 2,000 people living in one place. But you can see there is still distance between these populations. So obviously this group doesn't even get in the palisade, but this group and this group and this group, there's lots of space between them. They are not yet integrated. Then what happens is you get, and this will resolve itself in a minute, but you get a coalesced village with all of the people closely related. But I want to show you something. Watch the palisade in these slides. So it's like this in the first phase. It shrinks, and then it shrinks again. And in that shrinking, about 300 to 400 people leave. This is at about 1,500. The point I'm trying to make is the fluidity of populations in these communities. They join the community, but something social political may have happened that led to them wanting to leave the community and join another community or go somewhere else. But they did this after the hostility ceased at 1,500. And what that means is that we can't predict with certainty or map onto these villages one pattern. We have to look at each site to understand how people were moving around on the landscape. So on the bottom on this is what we think Mantle looked like in the beginning, far more integrated with an open plaza, and then people left, and it was a little less well planned in terms of the organization. On Mantle, we found a piece of iron that is wrought iron. Mantle dates to 1500 to 1520, and this is near Toronto. This piece of iron has to be early European iron. It was in a perfect archaeological context inside a longhouse under a longhouse bunk line. It was the only object in the feature. The iron itself, we believe, based on the time, to be Basque iron. And we have iron samples now that we're doing metallurgical analysis to demonstrate the similarity between Basque iron from Basconia and this piece, which is at the National Museum at the moment. We also found 2 pieces of copper that are European as well. To summarize, out of almost 200,000 artifacts, 3 pieces of European artifacts. 3. The only way that you could find them is to excavate the entire site. If you were doing normal testing, you wouldn't find them. So archaeologists working in the St. Lawrence on sites dating to 1500 have said, we don't find much European stuff, but that's because they're only excavating 4 or 5% of the site, and when they get to 100%, they may find those elusive handful of European objects that occurred that early. Obviously, sites that date after 1550 have far more European material. The other thing at Mantle were these pots, which are distinctive to the Mantle site. No other Wendat site has them. And these are from the Oneida area. An Oneida archaeologist named Tony Wonderly has found these and documented them on Oneida sites. So we know the Mantle people also had a connection with the Oneida. At Draper, where people came together, which we call coalescent, their stone ornamentation were all these pebble pendants. There's Draper, and the pebble pendants come from the north shore of Lake Erie. So the source of interaction was this way. They had some St. Lawrence Iroquois pottery this way, but by the time of Mantle, we find not these, but these. Discoidal, steatite, or soapstone beads and objects. The beginning, you start to see these pipes made of steatite as well. So where does this steatite come from? So just put that question aside for a minute. Recently, our firm has been excavating these sites. Here's Mantle, and we've moved over and started excavating these sites on Highway 407, which is the new highway in southern Ontario, and found a series of sites, and this one is 1350. There's a discontinuous palisade, some very clear long houses, but also some very small little houses. And we began to find here at 1350 steatite beads, discoidal ones. That's very early because the rest of the central North Shore Wendat sites. All of the communities moving through time don't have these at this time period. So this area is communicating with wherever this steatite comes from earlier. Joseph Picard is another site that we excavated. It's pre-coalescence. It's not before you get the big communities. On this site, it's 1450. We had 3 identical dates. It has St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery again. It has pipes, we believe, are St. Lawrence Iroquoian. And they cluster in one area. They have bone tools that are very like St. Lawrence Iroquoian that don't occur in frequency before 1450, and we believe are influenced from St. Lawrence Iroquoian. In fact, the Roebuck site in the Ottawa River area had 250 of these. And they're found in the same area, plus a few other midden areas. We found perforated gastropods. The only other time I have seen these is in Roland Tremblay's book on St. Lawrence Iroquoian, where he found them on a site. Never seen it in all of Wendake. It's showing the links to the east. So what you're looking at, these sites are on Lynn Creek. This is, through time, the presence of this steatite. There was some interesting presence of steatite between 1450 and 1500 on one of the drainages, but the point I wanted to make is that largely it's on the Lynn Creek sites, the Picard site, the Atsista site. And Picard, look at all these. There were dozens of them. It's how they were decorating themselves and presenting themselves to other Iroquoians. So we looked at this with XRF to see if we could source this. And our preliminary findings are that there is a source in Jefferson County among the Jefferson County St. Lawrence Iroquoians where this material comes from, or at least a large number of them come from. It's material given to us to test by Tim Abel. It's on this basis and other questions in the St. Anisette cluster that Adrian Burke is doing a much larger study with IPS to look at the sourcing of these steatite beads. And I'm beginning to work a new project with a much larger project with Jennifer Birch and Jeff Speakman at Georgia University to do the same thing. So we're really starting to, we're wondering where all this steatite is coming from, and is it the St. Lawrence Valley? So here's where Jefferson County is. Here's Hochelaga, Montreal. The other thing we found on Picard, the other thing we found on Picard is marine shell beads, but also walrus ivory. Finding walrus ivory at 1450, 30 kilometers east of Toronto, was a surprise. And it, if you like, presages the appearance of the metal, iron, at Mantle 50 years later. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that this, when we read about the Huron in Champlain, Sagard, and the Jesuit relations, we read about the route they took, right? Sometimes even into the Saguenay and down. And this is the route Champlain took in 1615. But clearly, there was, between 1300 and 1600, very clear access along the North Shore to materials not only from Jefferson County, but materials from further up the St. Lawrence. And these populations that live on the St. Lawrence are interacting directly with the populations that live here. Not only are they interacting with them, but by 1450, they're moving into communities in this area. people are moving around on the landscape. Linguistics tells us those languages are not that different. Sagard tells us that there are St. Lawrence Iroquoian language speakers living among the Wendat in the historic period. We already knew that from the archaeological record and from Champlain's record that says that they moved into that area. So in fact, what you have, the people that lived in this area join and become the deer. The people who lived in this area join and become the rock. But before that happens, there's clear east-west interaction along the St. Lawrence. We might have surmised that, but we're now gaining a lot of evidence for that. And if these communities are moving between here and there before they're Huron or before they're New York Iroquois, we never do see a St. Lawrence Iroquoian Confederacy. What that means is that the people who make up these people could be anyone who lived in this area. So when the Wendat moved up and became the deer, they already had St. Lawrence Iroquoians living among them. The people who become the rock, who are in the Benson area or in the Balsam Lake area, already had huge populations of St. Lawrence Iroquoians living among them. So the Wendat in Wendake were both. They were people who evolved directly there and people who are from the St. Lawrence. We're now understanding that from having done about 2 decades of very detailed research because of the laws that we have in Ontario that allow us to look at these sites in such detail. I just want to put this up because none of the work that I do would be possible without working very closely with the Huron-Wendat Nation. And of course, when anybody stands up and talks to you, they have a large team behind them, and those are the people that have been helping on this work. Thank you.